Formula One and America have always had something of an uncomfortable relationship, but that hasn't stopped us from producing two of the finest world driver champions in history, Phil Hill and Mario Andretti. Beyond only being competent Formula One drivers, they were also extremely talented in every other discipline they ever competed in. And yet, a dark cloud followed both of their world championships, a cloud that coalesced over the Italian Grand Prix as both men battled their teammate for that coveted title. Today on Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys, we're kicking off the first of a two-part special on the tragedies of America's F1 world champions. We'll start at the beginning with Phil Hill. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. Formula One and America have never really managed to get along. Both sides have done things their own particular way for so long that adopting the attitudes of the other would feel like a compromise in values. Before we delve into our American champions, I think we should really set the scene to understand a bit more about the weird and wild relationship between F1 and the United States. The primary difference between the two motorsport factions is that they both grew up on different continents. After all, just think about the American accent. As we filtered over from England and different groups filtered throughout the country, we all developed our own unique vocal patterns and ways of speaking. We might all speak the same language, but it's very clear that someone in New York comes from a different place than someone in Minnesota, and that's very different than someone who lives in London. That's because different kinds of people settled in all of those different areas, and when they became isolated from other vocal influences, they developed their own specific way of speaking. In a lot of ways, racing is similar. In Europe, centuries of organized civilization created a region with well-traversed roads and a framework for thinking about the world. After the Renaissance, we saw plenty of densely populated towns and cities come to the fore. When you put a bunch of people in one place, you can usually count on a working class to take care of basic human needs, while the wealthy classes have the luxury of thinking about things like science and philosophy and art. You then end up with people who can tinker around and develop things like engines, which they can then take and race on those well-traversed roads. This isn't out of necessity, but it's out of the sheer pleasure for the act of driving and racing. Over in America at the turn of the 20th century, we had a much more dispersed population that existed in a country that didn't have a history of planned human settlement. The indigenous populations that made America their home had totally different ways of interpreting and existing in the world, ways that relied less on dominating nature than on living in harmony with it. So we didn't have that rich roadway network like they had in Europe, and we didn't have tons of densely populated cities where rich folks could think and tinker and then head over to another city located close by. The early cars were still a luxury, but they were also quickly a necessity. Americans, as a result, had a much different way of thinking about the automobile and our pursuit of speed. The sheer nature of the continental divide can't make up for everything, though. After all, F1 has managed to set up really reliable presences in other far-flung countries. To understand that, I think we need to delve a little bit into the American motorsport psyche. Growing up here in the United States, I've generally found that our cultural mindset is a little oppositional and defiant. Our national identity is built on the belief that we are a land of freedom, and that we were a place where European or British settlers could go in order to forge a new way of life that was distinct from what was required overseas. We could worship differently, love differently, and experience life differently. Of course, our national identity is also founded on the myth that Europeans are the only ones with a culture, which we have historically denied to the indigenous peoples who lived in the Americas long before any Europeans arrived. But that's also part of what I mean by our oppositional mindset. We defined ourselves in opposition to the continental European culture, but in doing so, we still preserved a lot of original beliefs. The ancestors of our early colonizers had rules and regulations their descendants no longer wanted to follow, but those descendants weren't doing anything too radical. They followed plenty of the less offensive rules and regulations, but defined a national identity based on the ways they differed from Europe. The ideologies we developed in America, paired with the physical limitations of America's development, means that the American approach to racing is significantly different than what you'd find in Europe. I spoke about this in more detail in the previous episode titled Death at Watkins Glen, How One Forgotten Crash Changed Motorsport Forever. Since we didn't have that same network of public roads in Europe, our racing traditions were slower to develop, and they were often confined to horse tracks or disused airfields. As a result, we built different kinds of cars and raced them under different regulations compared to the international crowd. The tides started changing in the late 1950s. America began building permanent road courses that were designed to mimic the natural terrain tracks of Europe. We started importing more foreign cars in order to race them, meaning that we also started to learn what other countries were prioritizing in terms of technology and design. We saw the rise of several enterprising businessmen who pinpointed the potential for growth in America's small car clubs. The hope was that Americans and Europeans could cross the continental and ideological divide, but it would take a lot of work. After all, for the first decade of its existence, Formula One had included the Indy 500 on its calendar to create the illusion of an international championship, even though the rule sets were so different that there was never any actual legitimate crossover. Anyone who could figure out how to unite both factions would inevitably change motorsport forever. These next few weeks on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're celebrating some of the finest examples of motorsport excellence in America in the form of Phil Hill and Mario Andretti. But they're not the only men who have made a massive impact on racing history. We could easily add Rick Hendrick to the list, and that's exactly why you can celebrate his accomplishments with Home Field's new Hendrick collection. Rick Hendrick founded his first NASCAR team in 1984. Since then, he's gone on to accomplish a record-setting 303 Cup Series wins, which also netted 14 drivers' championships in the top tier of American stock car racing alone. Those kinds of numbers are frankly unheard of, but with icons like Tim Richmond, Jeff Gordon, and Jimmy Johnson behind the wheel, it's no surprise. So head over to Homefield Apparel, an all-American vintage-style clothing company, if you're looking to get your hands on some incredible Hendrick Motorsport merchandise. And don't forget to use the code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. If you saw Phil Hill around, the last thing you'd expect from him was skill behind the wheel of a race car. He hailed from a wealthy family that served as a pillar of the Santa Monica, California community, and he spent most of his childhood ill. When a polio outbreak swept through town, Hill's mother pulled all of her children out of school to teach them at home instead. Phil Hill wasn't good at sports, and as he grew up, he became the type of person who found comfort in collecting, of all things, player pianos. He was never quite the race car driver type. Perhaps it would help to know that his passion for racing stemmed from a desire to escape. Hill's family was ruled by a disciplinarian father and an alcoholic mother. The only place a young Phil Hill was encouraged to be himself was in the family garage and on the streets. He'd stand on the sidewalk with the local boys and challenge them to rattle off the names of approaching cars faster than he could, a losing battle against Hill, whose love of cars quickly bordered on obsession. It was as if I was trying to divorce myself from the presence of people around me and focus only on the cars, Hill is quoted as saying in The Limit by Michael Cannon. Philip Toll Hill Jr. was born on April 20th, 1927, in Miami, Florida, before moving to Santa Monica. He grew up going to school with members of William Randolph Hearst's family, or the wealthy American businessman and newspaper magnate. Hill was ever conscious of his family's grandiose displays of wealth in a depression-racked California. He didn't fit in with his family, and he didn't really fit in with the local children. The only person who seemed to understand him was his aunt, Helen Griselli. Griselli herself was wealthy. She was a socialite who, after divorcing her successful chemical manufacturer husband, moved down the street from her sister, who was Phil's mother. She spent her money doting on her niece and nephews, but it was Phil's consuming interest in her car collection that encouraged the two to bond. Griselli was the type of person who enjoyed the physicality of driving those early cars, particularly her Pierce Arrow LeBaron convertible town cabriolet. She never hesitated to dismiss her chauffeur to the passenger seat when there was a particularly challenging piece of road she'd like to conquer. When Hill was 12, she bought him his first car, a Model T Ford that she picked up from a used car lot for a mere $40, or about $900 today when accounting for inflation. That Model T became Hill's all-consuming passion. He pored over the machine, tearing it apart and putting it back together, then taking it to a quarter-mile oval on the Hearst estate to see if his tweaks could help him set a faster time. "I've always expressed myself via the automobile," Hill said, reported in The Limit. "I guess I sensed that I was in an insane environment and that my only escape was in something that had structure. Cars gave me a sense of worth. I could do something, drive, that no one else my age could do. I could take cars apart too, and when I put the nuts and bolts back together again and the thing worked, no one could prove me wrong. That kind of technology was fathomable, made sense in a way that people never did. Cars are easy to master. They hold no threat, and if you're careful, they can't hurt you like people can." That humble Model T paved the way for something greater in Hill's life. He had found a purpose. Hill took a part-time job pumping gas. Paired with the allowance that his family provided, he was able to start buying a succession of different cars that he took out to the streets to hunt for any other gearhead keen on a quick street race. For the first time in his life, Hill had found something in common with his peers. As he aged, he found work building nose guns during the Korean War. He hadn't been drafted due to sinus conditions that had plagued him since childhood. And then he went on to study business administration at the University of Southern California. He even went so far as joining a fraternity, but he really didn't find any meaning or joy in any of it. Instead, he took a job as a member of a midget car pit crew. Midget car racing should have been a shock to Hill's system. He'd grown up reading about the continental exploits of drivers like Alberto Ascari and Luigi Villaresi. His current discipline was far more blue-collar, more down-to-earth, and yet it was exactly what Phil Hill needed. The smell of gasoline and burnt clutch spoke to him, and he soon turned his focus to buying a British MG sports car in the hope of competing in some local races himself. When the midget car driver he worked for broke a leg, Hill subbed in. But he learned that he much preferred the European way of doing things, which he'd truly come to appreciate in his role as a salesman at a foreign car dealership. He convinced his boss at the dealership to send him over to Europe to study the fine art of repairing those unique kinds of machinery. He took on 1 month-long apprenticeship after another at auto firms like Jaguar, Rolls-Royce, and MG. While overseas, he attended the first ever Formula One British Grand Prix. He had fallen in love, but Hill still wasn't quite sure how to break into that world. In late 1950, he returned home to New York and road-tripped his brand-new Jaguar XK120 across the country. That November, he competed in the Pebble Beach Cup, where he stalled at the start and yet still managed to battle his way through the field to secure his first major victory. In March of 1952, his mother died. His father followed 3 weeks later of a heart attack. At just 25 years old, Phil Hill was alone in the world, but the death of his parents brought him more relief than anything else. The two people who had most tormented him, who had least understood him, no longer had control over his life. To celebrate, he funneled his inheritance money into a brand new Ferrari, a blue Barchetta that he paid a mere $6,000 for. The salesman, Luigi Canetti, had supposedly cut him a deal that saw Hill pay half price for the vehicle thanks to his promising driving talent. Canetti perhaps declined to mention that the exact vehicle Hill drove had been involved in an accident at Le Mans that beheaded its driver. There was even a hole still drilled into the floor of the car. It had been bored there to drain the driver's blood. all of that paled in the face of the fact that the car was quick and that Hill became a familiar face at the top step of the podium. Road racing in the early 1950s had grown considerably, but it was still the kind of affair that required Hill to travel from California to Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. He even took part in the massively dangerous Carrera Panamericana, a week-long rally that took place on 1,933 miles of freshly built roads designed to link Mexico to the United States. There, Hill joined the Ferrari team, which was otherwise composed of incredible talents like Giovanni Bracco, Alberto Ascari, and Luigi Villaresi. Hill was well on his way to becoming one of the most notable American racers on the international scene, but sharing a team with those continental legends raised in Hill an anxiety and a doubt that he would fail to shake for the rest of his career. Before the Carrera Panamericana, Hill was reduced to eating jars of baby food to prevent his ulcers from acting up. Still, in a race that had seen over 100 entrants, Hill not only managed to be one of the race's 39 finishers, but he also crossed the line in 6th place. With that one race, Phil Hill had distinguished himself on the international stage. Despite his success at the Carrera Panamericana, Phil Hill's road to Europe was not a simple one. At the 1954 Buenos Aires 1000, Hill watched the car of 50-year-old driver Eric Forrest Green burst into flames. Hill pulled over and raced to help, while Forrest Green dragged himself from the car and crawled toward Hill, totally immersed in fire. Every time he closed his eyes, Hill could see nothing but Forrest Green's final moments. His stress grew to the point that a doctor advised him to quit racing. If he didn't stop stressing himself out, his ulcer was about to hemorrhage. And for a brief period of time, that's just what Hill did. He took a job as a part-time mechanic in a foreign car dealership and lived with his Aunt Helen. He reconditioned Helen's Pierce Arrow in his free time, desperate to keep his mind occupied. He signed on to work on the set of the film The Racers, where he maintained the racing cars used in the movie, showed the actors how to drive them, and even did a little stunt driving. Then in October, Hill received an envelope from Dallas. It included a photo of a white Ferrari 375mm and one simple note, guaranteed not to cause ulcers. His passion for racing had been revived, and when he finished second in the 1954 Carrera Panamericana, he knew that he had found his calling. He was destined to race. In 1955, Hill and fellow California racer Richie Ginther were on a freighter to Europe when they received news that the legendary Grand Prix driver Alberto Ascari had died. The two men had intended to compete in a handful of overseas races with their own cars, but those plans quickly changed thanks to a memo from Luigi Canetti, the dealer who had sold Hill his first Ferrari. See, Canetti wasn't just a car dealer. He was Enzo Ferrari's primary American liaison, tasked not only with creating an American demand for Ferraris, but also with spotting impressive talent. Canetti advised Hill and Ginther to get off the freighter early and head directly to Modena, the little town that Enzo Ferrari called home. With Ascari dead, Ferrari needed, essentially, to replenish his driver stock. He showed Hill a gorgeous Ferrari 121 LM that he had prepared for Ascari to race at Le Mans and asked Hill what he thought. Then, he asked Hill if he'd like to drive it in the iconic 24-hour race. Phil Hill agreed, not knowing that he would witness the greatest tragedy in motorsport history, when Pierre Levesque's Mercedes would scythe through a crowd and kill over 80 spectators. The incident took place just in front of Hill, on his very first lap of the race. At this point, I was numbed by it all, shocked that all this could be happening at once, and on my first ever Ferrari racing lap of Le Mans, Hill said, after recounting how he witnessed a body burning on top of a hay bale. But then, Sterling Moss went by me like a streak in a Mercedes 300 SLR, and that woke me up. That was a lesson I never forgot. When something happens, get on the gas. Unfortunately, Hill wouldn't finish the race. After just 7 of Le Mans' 24 hours, the Ferrari's clutch gave out. In the wake of the 1955 Le Mans disaster, countless races around Europe were canceled, which meant that Hill's plans to show his racing merit in the continent were put on hold. He went home and competed in events all across America. In 1956, he went back to Buenos Aires for the 1,000-kilometer race where he finished second. In the pits after the race, Ferrari's team manager approached Hill and asked if he would like to join the iconic marque for the rest of the season. Weeks later, Phil Hill had set up a temporary home in Modena. It would not be an easy place for Hill to find his footing. Enzo Ferrari was notorious for the way he ruled over his domain, never hesitating to pit one of his drivers against another if it meant they'd both drive a little faster and with a little more desperation. Ferrari also didn't hesitate to play favorites, and he let Hill know almost immediately that he was not one of them. Ferrari, Hill said, was a man I respected, from whom I wanted nothing more than affection and for him to be a good daddy to me. He wouldn't get that affection. Hill was a shrewd driver, the kind that tried to win races by driving as slowly as possible and nursing his machinery the whole way. Enzo Ferrari, on the other hand, preferred gutsy showmanship and a tinge of desperation. That meant that Ferrari much preferred the other rookie on the team that year, Wolfgang von Trips. Count von Trips grew up in luxury, but the onset of World War II effectively crushed the dynasty that he was set to inherit. Von Trips turned his passion to cars. In pre-war Germany, Adolf Hitler had poured government money into German racing programs, both to become a beacon of automotive technology and also to create a focal point around which spectators could rally, full of national pride. Von Trips grew up admiring those prized German racers like Bernd Rosemeyer, but after spending his teenage years picking through air raid debris to find and remove mutilated corpses, he had become inured to the horrors of mankind. When the war ended, the Von Trips family was destitute, and Allied soldiers took over the family castle. Though he was expected to attend agricultural school and revive the family property, Von Trips instead fell in love with motorsport. He took a class win at the Mille Miglia, then was discovered by Alfred Neubauer, the portly manager of Mercedes-Benz's racing team, then later by Huschke von Hanstein, who led Porsche. In September of 1956, Enzo Ferrari offered him a single-seater to race at the Italian Grand Prix. By the mid-50s, Enzo Ferrari had put together an exceptional slate of racing talent that competed in everything from sports cars to Formula One Grand Prix. But he didn't hesitate to swap drivers from one discipline to the other, depending on how he felt they'd performed. He picked favorites, and he made those favorites known. While Wolfgang von Trips was one of Enzo's favorites, despite the fact that he was prone to making errors and crashing, Phil Hill was not. Nevertheless, the two rookies struck up an unlikely friendship. Anyone as intense as I was at the time was a bit skeptical of those like Von Trips, who seemed, at least on the surface, a bit lackadaisical, Hill said of his teammate, who had quickly earned the nickname Count Von Crash. But that was just what Enzo Ferrari wanted. As part of his eternal routine of mind games, Ferrari consistently provided Hill with older cars and kept him confined to sports car racing, despite the fact that Hill was desperate to move up to Formula One. Meanwhile, Ferrari treated Von Trips as something akin to a star. I began to feel that perhaps I was not ever going to be a really first-rate driver, that something in my makeup prevented me from reaching the ultimate stage in motor racing, Hill said of Formula One. There are several drivers who do well in sports cars, but can't seem to do well with a Grand Prix machine. I was beginning to be haunted by the fear that maybe I'd be one of them. I had to find out. And to find out, he was forced to defect. Hill turned to Maserati, one of Ferrari's biggest rivals, to make his racing debut at the Rem Grand Prix in 1958. He had an outdated machine and nevertheless finished in 7th place, a lap down from the winner and his Ferrari teammate Mike Hawthorne. It's entirely possible that Hill never would have had a shot with Ferrari's Formula One team had it not been decimated by tragedy. Luigi Musso and Peter Collins were both killed in races during the 1958 season, and after securing the championship, Mike Hawthorne retired. Months later, Hawthorne was even killed in a road accident. Hill was signed on for the 1959 season mostly out of necessity, but Ferrari began to treat him a little more seriously after his drivers began to drop like flies. Hill performed well. In 1959, he took 2 second-place finishes and 1 third place, which left him 4th overall in the championship. The only Ferrari driver who outperformed him was Tony Brooks. Brooks had 2 wins, but Hill was far more consistent in terms of scoring points. It was a sign of things to come. Then came 1960. That season, Hill and Von Trips served as Ferrari's 2 primary drivers, with a handful of others joining in for a race or two. The Cooper and Lotus teams were frankly unbeatable that season, which left Phil Hill finishing 5th overall in the Drivers' Championship. He was, however, the highest-placed Ferrari driver, and he also secured his first ever F1 win at the all-important Italian Grand Prix. Hill had proved himself to be more than just a competent Formula One driver. Instead, he was well on his way to being a star. Heading into the 1961 season, Ferrari debuted its first ever mid-engine race car, which we now know as the Shark Nose, thanks to the 2 vents on the side of the front. The vehicle was shockingly quick and a dream to handle thanks to its balanced weight, and it was clear from the start that it was going to be quick. Heading into that new year, Hill and Von Trips would be joined by a 3rd full-time driver, American Richie Ginther. It would have made sense for Enzo Ferrari to promote Phil Hill to team leader. The American racer had more than adequately proved himself to be an exceptional wheelman, the kind of driver that any team owner would adore to have. But that wasn't Ferrari's style. Instead, he made it clear that his drivers were entering 1961 on equal footing in his eyes. The tension was excruciating and could not be relieved by a frank expression of competitiveness, not acceptably anyhow, between friends and teammates, Hill said. It was the mindset that both he and Von Trips were forced to carry into 1961. The 1961 racing season began in May with the iconic Monaco Grand Prix. While it looked as if the Ferraris of Richie Ginther and Phil Hill would be the dominating forces of the day, British driver Stirling Moss instead took victory in his Lotus. Ginther was in 2nd, with Phil Hill finishing 3rd. Wolfgang von Trips was classified in 4th place, despite crashing on the final lap of the event. The American drivers on the Ferrari team were devastated. Phil Hill allegedly looked so broken during post-race interviews that it seemed as if he'd break down and cry at any moment. When a Ferrari aide hugged Richie Ginther after the race, he reported that it seemed as if Ginther's overalls were empty, saying he was shattered, all in. He had really given everything. Thankfully, the Ferrari crew didn't have to wait long to respond. 8 days later came the 2nd Grand Prix of the season in Zandvoort, and Von Trips took the lead almost immediately. He held that position right to the end of the event. Phil Hill had to content himself with a Ferrari-mandated 2nd place. When it became clear that Hill could catch Von Trips, Enzo Ferrari actually told the team to give his drivers team orders. According to Hill, they just didn't want us ripping each other up once the thing was stabilized. Hill was ready to respond at the next race of the year, the Belgian Grand Prix. He qualified on pole position and managed to fend off Von Trips' challenge until a blinding rain slowed the pack, and Ferrari team orders once again came into effect, this time to preserve Hill's 1st place. It was Hill's first win of the season, and it rocketed him up to 1st in the World Championship standings, just 1 point ahead of teammate Von Trips. The French Grand Prix was a bust for both full-time Ferrari drivers. Hill was classified 9th, 2 laps behind the winner, after an overconfident move at the Tilwa hairpin saw him skid to a stop. Moss then crashed into the Ferrari, and Hill had to push start his car to get it moving again. Von Trips, for his own part, retired with a blown engine. Ferrari still took victory, albeit with a one-off driver, Giancarlo Baghetti. Then came the British Grand Prix. Phil Hill qualified on pole position, with Von Trips back in 4th place, but heavy rains plagued the start of the event, and Hill had adjusted his brake balance before the race to accommodate a much drier track. On the 7th lap, he lost control. While he still maintained his lead for a while, the experience had shocked him enough that Von Trips was able to slip by for victory. the German ascended to the lead of the championship standings with 27 points to Hill's 24. It was the kind of momentum that you wouldn't want to give your teammate and your title rival, because the next race was the German Grand Prix, Von Tripp's home event. However, by this point, both drivers were worn down physically, mentally, and emotionally. Both men were already in their mid-30s, and they had seen their fair share of death and danger at the racetrack. The close battle between the two had also started to erode their friendship. But before the German race, Hill actually joined Von Tripp's at his family castle for the mid-season break. We don't know what they talked about at Von Tripp's castle, but back at the track, it was a much different story. Reflecting on the season, Hill later wrote, "As I had feared, Tripp's and I became involved in an increasingly bitter competition for championship points. Because the championship was at stake, I was not able to be reasonable and sensible about every race. After all these years, I should have been, automatically, but there was this continual counting of points. By mid-season, my concentration was suffering." That struggle was made clear in Germany when Stirling Moss took victory. Von Tripp's hadn't had any rest in the build-up to the race thanks to the increasing media demands, and at the start, he reflected that there were so many people around, so much excitement in the air. I would have preferred to crawl in a hole to get away, but I had to be there in the thick of it. There was no other way. That tension had got to both men. During the race, Hill spun and lost 30 seconds trying to right himself. It gave Von Tripp's a chance to pass his teammate, but Hill recovered the time and he surged past Von Tripp's near the end of the race. The German then responded by pushing his way forward, and the teammates drove side by side. On the final straight, heading to the checkered flag, Von Tripp's managed to push past for second place, 1.1 seconds ahead of Hill. Von Tripp's was sitting at 33 championship points. Phil Hill had 29. Then came the fateful Italian Grand Prix at Monza. It was set to be a difficult one. Hill had already won that race the previous season and knew what it took to win at the track. Von Tripp's, for his own part, had been involved in 2 nasty wrecks at Monza, which was a very high-speed track. Hill was twitching with anxiety ahead of the start. In practice, his Ferrari had begun to malfunction. When he tried to shift gears from second to third, the gearbox would drop him back into first, and somehow no one at Ferrari would take his word for it. Von Tripp's, for his own part, was very reflective, telling journalist Robert Daly that every driver has a place deep inside him where he's afraid of death. This could all end tomorrow. You never know. The start of the race told 2 different stories about 2 very different temperaments. Von Tripp's looked relaxed, munching on a pear as his team rolled his car out to pole position. Hill's mechanics, meanwhile, had spent the night changing Hill's engine. The gear issues meant the American would start in 4th place. Hill was agitated, knowing that he would have to push hard to keep hold of his championship hopes. But when that flag flew, Von Tripp's faltered. He had a very long history of struggling at the start of races, and this time it was no different. By the time the German driver launched into the pack, he was in 6th position, while Hill had gone by for the lead. Von Tripp's passed 2 cars on the first lap, desperate to reach Hill by passing new Ferrari racer Ricardo Rodriguez. Perhaps he was distracted by the car in front. Perhaps that's why he washed sideways into Jim Clark, who was attempting to pass him. Clark's front wheels collided with Von Tripp's rear wheels. At 150 miles per hour, it was a fatal move. Von Tripp's Ferrari slung into the 5-foot-tall dirt embankment that separated fans from the action. The only thing there to slow his momentum was a chicken wire fence and a row of spectators. The Ferrari scythed through 10 feet of the crowd before it came to rest. 5 spectators died immediately. 10 more died later of their injuries. Over 50 other people were injured. Von Tripp's flopped over his steering wheel. He died of skull fractures before the ambulance could arrive. The 1961 Italian Grand Prix carried on. Phil Hill passed the wreckage 41 more times from the lead of the race, trying to decipher who that wreckage belonged to. Then he noticed Von Tripp's name had disappeared from the scoreboard. The 9 points that Hill earned for his victory was enough to give him the World Driver Championship. No one told Hill that his teammate was dead. Ferrari allowed him to celebrate with the crowds and bottles of champagne. It was only after the podium that they told him the truth. Wolfgang von Trips, his teammate, had been killed in a brutal crash. Phil Hill was world champion, but at what cost? Phil Hill never had a chance to enjoy his World Drivers' Championship. After his victory at Monza, there was to be one final race, the United States Grand Prix, which would take place at Watkins Glen in upstate New York. Ferrari pulled out of that race. There was no need to continue its pursuit of a championship if it had already won. Phil Hill was denied the opportunity to take a victory lap in front of his home crowd. Hill had no one else to celebrate with either. He had no family. He was unmarried. His closest friends were racing drivers, and they were all either in mourning or busy preparing themselves for the next race. Headlines were dominated not by a Hill's World Championship, but by the horrific death toll at Monza. It was as if Hill had not existed at all. Phil Hill served as a pallbearer for Wolfgang von Trips at a funeral that represented the death of both a racing driver as well as the hopes and dreams of a nation. For all the Germans, Trips was going to be the new world champion, Hill reflected later. I had to go on as this terrible disappointment. He also wrote, I have never experienced anything as profoundly mournful as that day. It was a nightmare acted out in daytime. Schools closed for the day, and thousands of people turned out to watch Von Tripp's casket ride through the streets atop his Ferrari Roadster. There were several different masses, and as Von Tripp's casket was placed in his family tomb, rain poured. Hill was full of conflicting emotions. Yes, he was mourning the death of a friend and compatriot, but the most important moment of his career, the thing that he had been fighting for since he first started racing, had been entirely overshadowed. When he returned home to Santa Monica, no one really knew who he was. Reflecting on Ferrari's refusal to participate in the US Grand Prix, Hill said, I was really sick about that, for that day should have been the crowning glory of my career, the biggest day of my life. Instead, Phil Hill was forced to watch the race from home. Then, as if to further drive in how obscure he was, Hill appeared on the game show To Tell the Truth in that December. The whole purpose of the show was that a group of panelists had to guess the guest's achievement. On the show, Hill was asked if his life had changed thanks to his achievement. He said, not at all. If you mean, do people recognize me and stop me on the street? They don't. Hill continued to race in Formula One. He re-signed with Ferrari for 1962, taking 3 podium finishes in a row before his performance quickly dropped off. He raced in a handful of events for the next 3 years, where his best finish was a 6th place. His true, enduring talents were found in the sports car realm. Hill would go on to win the 24 Hours of Daytona and the 24 Hours of Le Mans, with a class win at the 12 Hours of Sebring. He retired and took up roles as a classic car restorer, a commentator for ABC's Wide World of Sports, and a contributor to Road and Track magazine. He died on August 28, 2008, at 81 years old. Of all of the topics I've covered so far on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, I think the tragedies of America's... Of all of the topics I've covered so far on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, I think the tragedies of F1's world champions could be seen as being less impactful than, say, a kidnapping that led to a revolution, or a death that changed the entire scope of America's racing culture. But I wouldn't say that's quite accurate. In fact, to really understand the scope of these tragedies, I think we actually have to consider all of the missed opportunities that could have arisen from our American world champions, and all of the ways that now Formula One has suffered because of it. We never really had a chance to celebrate our homegrown champion Phil Hill, or to take pride in his accomplishments on an international scale. Even modern Formula One fans really don't know who he is. We've never been able to appreciate what he's done because the positives were immediately outweighed by the negatives. Triumph instantly was underscored by tragedy, and the moments of American victory also, unfortunately, were the moments of intense pain. It is understandably difficult to hold two very distinct concepts in mind at the same time. It's difficult to look at the 1961 Italian Grand Prix and see any good in an event that killed an exceptional driver and 15 spectators. It will be just as difficult in the next episode when we look at the 1978 Italian Grand Prix and see It'll be just as difficult to look at the 1978 Italian Grand Prix, and it'll be just as difficult in the next episode when we look at the 1978 Italian Grand Prix. We will be hard-pressed to see anything but the disappointing safety protocol that resulted in Ronnie Peterson's death. Tragedy has relegated America's two iconic world champions to the sidelines of Formula One history, but that pain is perhaps at its pinnacle with Phil Hill. Within the first 11 years of Formula One's existence, we had an American driver competing at the highest level of motorsport, and not only competing, but he was winning. And yet his success is forgotten, much to the detriment of F1's perception of America, even today. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. Next time, we'll be covering Mario Andretti's championship year. In the next episode, we'll be covering Mario Andretti and his 1978 championship year in order to really understand how America's most iconic drivers have been forgotten on the main stage of motorsport. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, please make sure to subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts where I delve deeper into contemporary motorsport news, as well as newsletters that round up the biggest events, both past and present, that you should be paying attention to. Plus, if you want to send an email, I have an address for that: deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Thank you again to everyone who has left reviews or comments of this show. I am still working my way through understanding the audio-visual world, and every comment helps me improve for the future. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel. The Hendrick collection drop is absolutely incredible, with retro-style hats and shirts and jackets inspired by legends like Jeff Gordon, Tim Richmond, and Jimmy Johnson. The next few drops will be open wheel themed, so if that's more your jam, make sure you're signed up at the link in my bio. And don't forget to use DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find a full list of sources in the episode description. First off, if you want to hear more about Phil Hill and his 1961 World Championship battle, I was actually a guest on Donut's Past Gas podcast, where we talked about just that. Episodes 186 and 187, titled The Only American-Born F1 World Champion and The Ferrari Curse Was Broken by American, Both talk about Phil Hill and the stunning battle he had with Von Trips for that 1961 title. As far as my reference material goes, I was particularly inspired by The Limit, Life and Death on the 1961 Grand Prix Circuit by Michael Cannon. It is an incredible book, one of the best motorsport books I've ever read, and I keep finding myself reading it over and over again. Make sure you go get a copy, it's so good. For other information in this episode, I also referenced Phil Hill, A Driving Life, The American Legacy in Formula One, and Monza, A Glorious History. Thank you so much for tuning in.